Hello and welcome once again to Module 1. In this presentation, we'll discuss some additional concepts and foundational ideas related to international and comparative higher education. I'm going to spend a bit of time reviewing the questions that are on the screen here. And one of the things that I want to emphasize is that I'm not going to spend too much time on ideas that are already explained clearly in the readings. So for instance, our first question, what are foundational terms and concepts in international and comparative higher education? So there's some great ideas and information provided in your assigned readings, and I'm going to supplement and complement what's described there. So if you have any additional questions about the readings themselves, please pose those questions to your instructor directly, as well as any questions about this presentation. So my purpose here is really to clarify some things that I think are a bit vague and additional considerations that you'll need to be aware of throughout the course. And this is where that second question here comes in. Who are the global actors in higher education and how do they influence policy and practice? As well as I want to foreshadow some topics that will be presented throughout every module of this course in terms of some of the tensions that are inherent in international and global higher education. Okay, so starting with some concepts that, at least from my own experience, when I started working in this area as someone approaching international and comparative higher ed from the United States, these were terms that I wasn't quite sure what they meant. Both are more frequently used outside of the U.S. context than in it, but you might already know what tertiary means. Essentially, it's a synonym for post-secondary education. It encompasses especially lower degree and certificate levels like technical schools, as well as through universities and four-year and postgraduate degrees. And then related at the technical level is the term TVET. So that stands for Technical and Vocational Education and Training Institutes. Basically what we in the U.S. think of as vocational schools or associate's degree programs that are pretty focused on specific employment paths. And actually, so here's a picture of a TVET classroom that I worked with quite extensively on a project in Ethiopia and funded by USAID. This is Addis Ababa Tegberid College. And let me tell you, at least from an employability standpoint, my observations personally of TVETs are pretty phenomenal. The drawback is that, of course, the skills developed in these contexts can be pretty narrow, unlike a broader bachelor's degree, but especially in developing world contexts, TVETs play an important role in the higher ed ecosystem, and they're really important for economic development in terms of thinking of employment and meeting sort of workforce needs. Of course, another key concept that you need to understand for this class is what we mean by the term comparative and how that idea is related to, but a bit different from, internationalization and globalization. So it's kind of intuitive. Comparative higher education refers to comparing and understanding the extent to what we observe in one setting can be applied to other settings. But I do want to note that at the foundational level, there really is just one universal academic model worldwide today. It comes from the basic university model in Europe, especially that one that was established in France in the 13th century, which centered academia around professors as teachers as opposed to students or administrators, and then also introduced later the role of researchers. So in the 1800s, I think you might have read about this, when Germany was under the leadership of Wilhelm von Humboldt, he invested in universities to support the country's economic development and innovation. That's when graduate programs were established, academic departments were organized around disciplines, and also the knowledge creation aspect of professors' jobs became more prevalent. But again, what I want to point out is that the general institutional model, organizational structure, governance approach, and purposes of higher ed that were established by the Europeans are pretty much universal today. But that's at the macro level. So there are a lot of differences in the details, and this is where comparative higher ed comes in. We can learn a lot for international policy, research, and theory building when we compare different contexts and settings to each other. But one of the ongoing challenges in comparative scholarship, which was introduced in one of the readings you were assigned in this module, is what is the most appropriate unit of analysis for comparing one context to another. So as you'll see from the readings and content throughout this course, scholars in the field of comparative higher education are not solely interested in geographic borders. So it would be kind of arbitrary, right, to compare higher education outcomes in the United States to Zimbabwe, to Chile, to Singapore. There needs to be some type of conceptual justification for comparing different contexts. And on this screen here are 4 common approaches that scholars, so this is important, I'm going to get to policymakers in a second, that scholars use to think about what and how different contexts should be compared. So, first, thinking about nations and universities that are considered to be part of the industrialized world versus the developing world, or the global north versus the global south, the west versus the east, and or what scholars call research center versus research periphery countries and institutions. So each of these approaches, all 4 of these approaches, comes from the same idea, that there are a group of countries that are quote unquote intellectual and institutional centers that provide models and innovations which give direction to the rest of the world's higher education systems. So then at the other end of the continuum, and this is where this idea of periphery comes in, those universities adopt ideas and approaches originating from the center. So most of the world's universities would fall into this idea of periphery, and mostly they're focused on teaching and distributing knowledge rather than sort of being global leaders in research and innovation. So as you might imagine, at least from the scholarship standpoint, a huge theme underlying these comparisons is issues of equality and inequality as well as neocolonialism. So here's a definition, it's a bit dated, of neocolonialism, at least in the context of higher education. Essentially, from an academic standpoint, it's the critique that this process of center versus periphery is problematic and reproduces global inequality. And if you get into the comparative literature, this idea of neocolonialism is a very common theme that you'll encounter. So really, this is just an introduction to how comparative scholars think about their units of analysis. But policymakers often think a little differently. As you might imagine, policymakers really don't care too much about periphery versus center or global north versus global south, at least where higher ed comparisons come in. They're much more interested in how their country system compares to others. So here's an example of how policymakers respond to comparative scholarship from my own work in Ethiopia. So in 2025, a researcher in India published a comparison of potential research misconduct by academics in various countries. So more specifically, he looked at how frequently journal articles are subsequently retracted or unpublished. And this is often a signal that a study was either plagiarized or used some sort of falsified data or engaged in other type of misconduct. He collected data between 2022 and 2024 from countries that had at least 100 retractions during those 3 years. And here is the list of countries that had at least 100 total retractions. So he just did some very basic descriptive and correlational analyses, but as you can see here, he found that among the countries globally that had the most retraction rates, Ethiopia had by far the most. So this didn't actually come as a total surprise to me or my Ethiopian colleagues. There's a lot of pressure from the government, the Ministry of Education, on professors to publish articles. Huge emphasis on quantity over quality. But when this study was released, the media picked up on it in Ethiopia. And then the Ministry of Education has responded by prioritizing research ethics trainings for their academic staff across the country. And actually, I'm developing an online course with some of my counterparts in Ethiopia to help address this issue. Although my advice to the ministry would be that a training program maybe isn't enough. Perhaps they should revisit how they incentivize publications in the first place. But regardless, this is a good example of how comparative research has a clear influence on both policy and practice when countries are benchmarked against each other. So for at least the Ethiopian government, seeing how their retraction rates compared to other countries was a really compelling motivation for policymakers to realize that they needed to make some changes. So that's the basic idea of comparative higher education. Now getting into internationalization. So the readings you're assigned in this module go into a lot of detail about the definition and how it's changed over time. You can think of internationalization as the process of how higher education systems, individual colleges and universities, and individual people integrate an international or intercultural or global dimension into their work or other activities. So what you read about is pretty theoretical, and from a more real-world perspective, I think it's interesting to look at how researchers have operationalized internationalization. So specific to the U.S. context, there's this 2007 study, and you can find the full text to link to on Module 1 supplemental materials on Canvas. But basically what these researchers did was propose a series of metrics or indicators to capture how international U.S. universities are. As you can see here, they organized the indicators around 5 dimensions. So student characteristics, especially related to international exchanges and academic majors, scholar characteristics, like the extent to which professors participate in international collaborations and exchanges. They separately looked at research orientation activities and how extensive an institution's faculties are engaged in international studies, as well as foreign language work. They also included some measures here for curricular content, like course requirements, which have international aspects. And then finally, organizational support for internationalization. And then because we're Americans, we like competition and ranking things, so they actually collected data to determine which universities in the U.S. are more international according to these metrics. Again, I will say that these data are from the early 2000s, so a lot has changed since then, but at the time, the most international university in the U.S., according to this, was Columbia University in New York City, one of our Ivy League institutions. Second was, I think, UC Berkeley, then Georgetown, Chicago, Harvard, and then Michigan State actually was very high on the list, which didn't surprise me because Michigan State as a land-grant institution was a pioneer collaborating on agricultural projects around the world, especially universities in Africa. That's when USAID existed as a federal agency, though, so I'm not sure how Michigan State's internationalization will look like going forward without that funding source. But anyways, ASU, in this rankings list, ASU was on it, but farther down. I think it was in the top 50. But again, these data were old, and it was kind of when Michael Crow was coming into ASU, and during his tenure, he's really encouraged internationalization at the university, and I am an example of that. So I have a feeling if this study was run now, it might look a bit different. But this is just, how an example of how scholars have, or how we can think about the extent to which practically internationalization looks like on our U.S. university campuses. And I really encourage you to check out the full article. I think it's a really nice piece. Another key point I want to make about internationalization is the issue of language. Obviously, in order to work in other countries, we need to be able to communicate. Originally, when the very first universities were founded in the 13th century, the original language of instruction was primarily Latin. Then, in the 1500s, political changes in Europe resulted in universities shifting to teaching more in their own languages. Then, in the 1800s, as Germany became a global leader in academic research, scholars from other countries needed to learn German in order to engage in collaborative research across those borders and also publish in the top academic journals, which were published in German. But then, due to World War II and the Nazification of German universities, they lost their dominance in the global setting. And so English became the dominant language of science. Again, this idea of academic journals has been a key mechanism for English becoming a dominant language internationally because almost all of the top journals right now publish in English. So if scholars in non-English speaking countries want to publish, they have to have English proficiency, at least in their disciplines. Also, where teaching is concerned, almost all countries use European languages, and China is a very notable exception. I think there are a few others like Indonesia, Malaysia that use indigenous languages in their universities instructing, but that's, very uncommon. And this use of European languages and English, I want to emphasize, is a legacy of how many universities in colonial contexts were established. Like, for example, France colonized Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Cameroon, and French is still the language of instruction in their higher education systems. And from a personal standpoint, I've observed this even in countries that weren't colonized. They still have adopted global North languages. Ethiopia, for example, is the only country in Africa that was never colonized, but the official language of instruction in their schooling system from 8th grade onwards and all of higher education is English. There's actually some internal dynamics involved because the country actually has over 80 indigenous languages, and so picking one as the official language of instruction was basically a political minefield. But nonetheless, there's some valid critiques about the disappearance of indigenous ways of knowing through language being replaced by, Western culture more broadly with language. And one thing I also want to emphasize, more from a critical scholarship standpoint, is that this use of English and European languages has implications for global inequalities, right? So obviously, it gives advantage to the West, where the most prestigious journals are published, and new ideas and innovations and involvement in that intellectual life requires proficiency in these languages. So this is an important aspect to keep in mind when we're thinking about this process of internationalization. So clearly, certain European countries, as well as the United States, have had an outsized influence on higher education around the world. But I also want to highlight several other, what we call multilateral NGOs, that have had a huge influence today on higher education, particularly in the developing world and research periphery contexts. And those are especially the World Bank, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, and then UNESCO, which is an arm of the United Nations. So how do these multilateral actors affect higher education? Basically through money. They spend a lot of money on their agendas, particularly in the developing world, and countries accept that money in order to improve their systems, but they have to adhere to the agendas set out by those different actors. So the World Bank, for example, their mission is economic. You might assume that from their name. So they're especially focused on income growth for the most poor countries and people in the world. And so due to their investment in various countries, we've seen an expansion of private higher education, including for-profit institutions. They've also encouraged the introduction of tuition and fees in many contexts where higher education was previously free of charge and completely subsidized by taxpayers, as well as partnerships between industry and university and sort of performance-based funding mechanisms or models in developing contexts. Similar, OECD is really emphasizes economic development as well, and so their investment in various developing countries has been to encourage university curriculums to be very focused on, again, employment and industry needs. They're really heavily invest on vocational training as opposed to more broad-based liberal arts type education in the developing world, and really promote sort of tight connections between, again, higher education and the labor market. UNESCO is a bit of a different case. So their emphasis through the UN is more on human rights as well as access and equity for marginalized groups. So they have a lot of programs they've invested in to support refugee access to higher education as well as other marginalized groups. And they also, and you'll kind of come across reference throughout this course to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So UNESCO is also really focused on various initiatives for higher education to promote sustainable development related to, climate change and other sort of environmental needs. So in addition to these multilateral organizations, which invest, are consortiums of investors representing various countries and contexts that then invest in other countries and contexts, so multilateral, there are also state-affiliated global actors in the international development context. So bilateral development agencies that are specific to individual countries that are really aimed at improving economic, political, and social well-being of people in developing countries. And so tertiary education, higher education is certainly an important aspect of international development from that perspective. So here's some examples of various international development agencies that are country specific. Korea, Germany, actually, my work in Ethiopia, GIZ, is a big actor in the higher education context, as well as the British Council. And this is another, DFID is another British agency that invests a lot in the developing world. And we can also recognize that the U.S. previously had a huge role in sort of international development in the higher education context through USAID, which I actually worked on several USAID-funded projects myself, but it, at least during the Trump administration, that agency has been pretty much shuttered. So the U.S.'s presence going forward in terms of bilateral development in higher education is still a bit unclear. Likely, at least for the short-term future, will probably be less present. But these other, especially based in Europe, as well as the Korean International Development Agency has a pretty strong presence in Africa as well, and Canada's IDRC is actually a really great entity as well in this international space. But all of these country-specific or state-affiliated actors have an important influence, again, on higher education, especially in the global South contexts. A final point I want to make about globalization and internationalization in higher education, which you'll continue to encounter throughout this course, is that there are a lot of tensions in terms of how this really should look like right now. First of all, this idea of competition versus cooperation. So to what extent are national systems and individual institutions rivals in the global context, competing for students, for research success, for money, etc.? Or, from an internationalization standpoint, should the goal be to cooperate and partner together across geographic and other types of boundaries for mutual benefit? A related tension that I already mentioned is between Western orientation towards higher education versus indigenous models, and the critique that Western dominance, especially through the influence of the multilateral and bilateral organizations I mentioned, is basically a modern version of colonialism. Also related is the tension between higher education as a public good with service to society, which has been a value embraced by many countries' systems historically. So you'll read a paper I co-wrote about how central this idea has been in many Latin American countries. But then on the other hand, neoliberalism relates to many of the policies implemented by the World Bank, OECD, and other capitalist country actors, shifting from viewing education and higher education as a private commodity driven by market principles and by competition. So this perspective often, from a neoliberal standpoint, emphasizes individual responsibility versus public and reduces the state involvement in higher education, which often leads to increased tuition and fees. So we're definitely going to talk a lot about that in Module 3. Importantly, that these different dynamics have resulted in tension around what universities globally should teach. Should our curriculum be driven by market needs, so what industry needs, with a focus on vocational training and preparation for the global labor market? Or should universities today be also helping students to become better citizens, understanding how to contribute from a cultural standpoint to society, etc.? So as I said, you'll encounter these tensions throughout this course, and they're really foundational to many of the issues we'll be grappling with in contemporary, comparative, and international higher ed.